What's up guys, welcome back to another video. Today I want to take you through 7 tips to make better street photography at night, so you can take your images from looking a bit bland and boring to looking something a lot more like this. Now street photography at night can be really tricky. In fact, street photography is tricky. Let's be honest, it's hard. But at night, it's extra hard. So my job here today is to help you make it a bit easier. Starting with point number 1, which is find the light. And that does sound a little bit obvious. However, what you've got to think about is your location. The location that you want to shoot in to get the most areas with the most light. For example, if you go to London, we're looking at Soho, we're looking at Piccadilly Circus, and maybe Chinatown. Those are the areas that are going to have the most light, which is going to make my life much easier when I have to change my camera settings, which very coincidentally is point number 2. So what exactly are we changing in our settings? Now, I love to shoot aperture priority, and wherever I can, I shoot aperture priority. It makes my life so much easier when trying to expose a photo. Now, there are obviously nuances where you would shoot manual. For example, if you're doing long exposure or some movement photos, then you're definitely going to need to use manual. Using aperture priority would be very difficult. But for argument's sake, today we're going to talk about aperture priority. Now, what we need to work out in our settings is where we can keep our images looking sharp without blowing them out, without adding too much noise. So finding the light is key to having enough light in our camera to not blow out the settings. Most important one to start with is your shutter speed. Now, you're going to want to keep your shutter speed above 160, 200 as an absolute minimum. If you've got stabilization in your lens, you might get away with a little bit lower than that, especially if you're very stable. But bear in mind, obviously, in street photography, we have people moving around all the time. So once we've got our baseline of our shutter speed, 160, 200, we can look at our ISO. ISO, generally speaking, is where we can add the most sort of light by changing the sensitivity of the sensor. I personally don't like to go too much above 1600. However, cameras these days, you can get away with going to 3200 and above, but I personally would stick to 1600 and below. I've got a mirrorless camera. It's absolutely brilliant in the night situations. However, I still would keep to 1600 and below. If I want to add any grain, I'd rather do that in post. Once we've established our baseline for shutter speed and our ISO, we can then look at our aperture. Now, every camera lens will have a different low aperture, but ideally in a perfect world, we'll keep it as low as possible. I am going to go into more detail about this shortly, but for now, we'll just keep the aperture as low as possible. And what we're going to do is then help our shutter speed stay above 160 to 200 by using the aperture. So obviously the aperture triangle working together to keep the settings so we can keep those nice clean images. So we touched on aperture there, which brings me on nicely to number 3, which is use prime lenses. Prime lenses are going to make your life much easier when shooting at night, because generally speaking, prime lenses can bring you a much lower aperture than a zoom lens. I've got a 24-70 zoom lens which suits f4, which is absolutely rubbish at night, so I don't use that. I generally will use a 50 or 85mm lens, which gives me a 1.2 or a 1.4 aperture, which lets as much natural light into the camera, which means I don't have to worry about cranking up the ISO too high or dropping the shutter speed too much, which obviously would make shooting at night much more difficult. Point number 4, and this is quite an important one, because if you're like me and when you're shooting street photography, you like to run around. I'm a bit of a runner. I'll be all over the place. I'll walk in, and I'll see somebody with a cool hat on or a cool umbrella, and I'll chase them down the street. But when you're doing night photography, that can be a bit more difficult, because point number 1, find the light. Doesn't always happen when you chase a subject. So what we're looking for here is find some good locations, slow down, use that one location, and you might just have to wait around a little bit for the subject or the subjects to come along. Point number 5, which is possibly my favourite, is shoot silhouettes. I love shooting silhouettes. You can get some really cinematic, cool photos by shooting silhouettes, and it's much easier than trying to expose the subject and the light at the same time during night. So try and shoot silhouettes, and it makes your life much more easier while still getting cinematic photos. Point number 6, and that's shoot details. Now, shooting details at night or interesting textures makes your life much easier, because you can stop, slow down, make sure you're focused, make sure your shutter speed is correct, make sure your ISO isn't too high, and everything can be controlled in a much more comfortable way. you can also get some really cool shots like this. And those photos there will give you a completely different perspective of wherever you're shooting and will help you tell a story, but a different type of story than shooting specific subjects. And if you're lucky, you can get subjects behind the texture, and that creates really cool atmospheric cinematic photos. Number 7, last but not least, is, I've forgotten actually, what is number 7? Shutter speed. Yes, so we talked about shutter speed and keeping your shutter speed above 160 to 200. Now what we can do is switch our camera to manual. Switch it to manual, drop the shutter speed, expose correctly using the ISO and your aperture, and then try and use movement to create a different type of photo. Again, like we talked about in the last point, use textures to create a different type of story within your photos, but you can do the same thing with movement. For example, I've taken a few photos here for you to have a look at. These photos are a little bit different, certainly not my strongest point of photography. It's something I would like to improve on, but by doing that, it gives you a different perspective and you can create some really cool stories by creating different types of photos. I'm Nathan Miles, aka NJM Flicks. You can find me on Instagram at NJM Flicks. I hope you found that video interesting. I personally am trying to get better at night street photography, so these points have really helped me, so hopefully they'll help you. Have a go. If they do help you, drop me a comment, drop me a DM. I'd love to hear how they helped you. If you did enjoy it, hit that like button, make sure you're subscribed, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.